Welcome back to Rethinking Politics, episode 65. You're welcome, Brad. I keep inviting you back.
And I keep showing up. Here we are, 65 times later.
65 times later. Okay, so today there are three different things we want to talk about. We want to talk about Kenosha. We want to talk about a vaccine-related thing. And we want to talk about the new University of Austin. The last two are related, so we're going to begin with Kenosha, which stands alone a little bit and is probably going to be shorter than the other two. Kenosha is the place where Jacob Blake was shot, wounded. He didn't die. There were riots afterward. This was during the time when Black Lives Matter was big, and there was lots of protests. This one was certainly a riot. There was burning and looting. Kyle Rittenhouse is now on trial. If you followed any news in the last week, you probably heard about this. Which is surprising. Yes, it surprises me. There are a lot of other cases that you could be following right now, or at least other things you could be looking at, and then there have been other cases that seem more, well, less clear-cut than this one. But no, this one has got a lot of attention. I thought it would kind of slide under the radar, honestly.
No, and it's made it quite big, and it's been quite political.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has. I've been surprised.
And it's something that we talked about a while ago, a long time ago, about the shootings and about how the left and the right made up their mind almost immediately about Kyle Rittenhouse's guilt or innocence. And we made the comment, and basically our whole episode was about the fact that there's not enough evidence and to sit tight and wait. And now we've reached the point that you're supposed to sit tight and wait for, as we've got this court case that is looking at the evidence and looking at whether or not he's innocent and guilty. Yes. And strangely enough, it seems no one's changed their mind.
Right. Yeah. We looked at, you could have made an initial assessment based on what was available. But you have to recognize that whatever that assessment was in the absence of some evidence that was going to come forward, right? That could change things. Mm-hmm. And especially since the events hinge on an initial event that then kind of cascades. The people chasing him is in part related to the first shooting when he shoots Rosenbaum, and so what happens there between him and Rosenbaum is absolutely critical.
Yeah, and there's lots of little details that even though you have some of the information, doesn't mean you have the full story on what happened there. Right.
So our initial assessment of what was there was that it appeared to be self-defense from what we knew. It appeared that he was being attacked in each of the cases, being chased by Rosenbaum in that first case. The evidence that has since come forward has confirmed that. There's been more evidence suggesting that Rosenbaum was lying in wait for him and then chased him and tried to grab the rifle, and that this is when Kyle Rittenhouse turned to shoot him. Seemed to be self-defense. The others are similar in that he's being attacked. He's trying initially to just run, not use violence, and then turns and fires, shoots one other person who dies. Rosenbaum died, the first person, and then the third person, I believe, in the shooting order, the second two were very close together.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but I think that's correct on the shooting order.
That third one actually drew a gun, pointed it at him, and then was shot, or was in the process of pointing it at him when he was shot. So in all these cases, it appears to be self-defense, and all of the things that have come forward, all of the details that Brad mentioned, the witness testimonies, right, that we might not have had available immediately, an FBI surveillance video. Mm-hmm. Turns out when you're looking through your Wi-Fi options, and one of them says FBI surveillance van number 6, it was actually there this time, right? Flying a drone or something and had some overhead video. All of these have made the case clearer and clearer that it was in self-defense, to the point where a lot of people have suggested that this shouldn't be a case at all, that the prosecutor should not have brought these charges because the evidence, and by these charges I mean charges of murder essentially, that these charges were so clearly wrong. And that, I think that stands pretty well, but that's not what's been the most interesting thing about this case.
Well, and the thing is that what I would argue is that, probably some charges should have been brought by a prosecutor at some point.
Mm-hmm.
What those charges are is another question, and part of the problem is the fact that the charges were brought forward so incredibly quickly after the case that it begs the question, how political is this?
Uh-huh.
How political is this when the charges are brought out 2 days later and the charges are some of the most severe options possible, even though already there was a lot of evidence that it looked like self-defense, even back then, begs the question, why? And I think it's pretty obvious that, as we've seen with the media following of this case, that this case is in many ways a continuation of the Black Lives Matter movements and protests and George Floyd and everything else, and it's a continuation of that. And so it's just become political. It's just become a political issue like any other. Kyle Rittenhouse is not a 17-year-old kid who got involved in what I would describe as chaotic events in the middle of protests and riots and fires, and crap happened. No, Kyle Rittenhouse is a symbol of white supremacy in all of its forms, and these people who were killed by him are a symbol of Black Lives Matter, even though, that's just it's not accurate to this case. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. The specifics of the case don't really matter. And that's true of so many things. I mean, in this case, he's being accused of being a white supremacist, even though all of the individuals that were shot were white, as far as I understand it.
Yeah,
I don't know what it's called when someone can decide their ethnicity and all of that, but I'm not a specialist. The word I'm looking for? But I can't tell you what it's called.
I don't, but I'm sure there is such a thing, and I'm sure there's a funny version of that thing as well, because it's...
And I was going to guess, and then I realized how stupid I'd sound, so I decided to withhold my guesses.
Right. Well, whatever the case is, I mean, the fact that he shot 3 white people is besides the point, in that, like, as you were saying, that the story is that he was there because he wanted to shoot people, specifically black people, and these white people were a part of this protest in favor of black people, and so it's... The whole story, the initial story was one of racism, and the facts don't bear out any claim of racism. Yet there hasn't been a single accusation or a single shred of evidence that suggested he was there for racist reasons. It's just like I said, there was a story. The facts have now become very clear, and they don't support that story, but that story is still alive and well. You can look at different news articles about this. The headlines are funny in that normal black humor way where you're like, what are you talking about? Like, why is this the headline? The headline should be, it appears that Kyle Rittenhouse had fired in self-defense, or something like that, if you wanted to learn about the case. Instead, it focuses on other things like...
Or not even it appears it was self-defense, but, key witness testimony, states, that Kyle Rittenhouse only fired after a gun was pointed at him, something like that.
Right. Confirms that Rosenbaum was trying to go specifically after Rittenhouse, or these are the things on which the case hinges on.
Yeah, these crucial facts and details.
Yeah. Instead, it's like Kyle Rittenhouse cries, or right, or Kyle. What were some of the other ones? Man expresses how he thought he was going to die when the survivor expresses his fear of death as Kyle Rittenhouse, before Kyle Rittenhouse pulled the trigger and shot him in the arm, right?
Because that's not relevant to the case, really. I mean, that's not what the case hinges on, of whether or not the guy who got shot thought he was going to die. If he didn't think he was going to die, does that mean Kyle Rittenhouse is innocent? Right. You know what I mean? I didn't think I thought I was just fine. Then Rittenhouse shot me. Oh, well, then he's not guilty of anything. Oh, but you thought you were going to die and then he shot you? Yeah, he should go to jail.
No, clearly,
it doesn't make sense. That's not relevant.
Clearly, the goal
What's relevant is why he shot you and what happened.
Right. What that is relevant to is to garner sympathy if you think that Kyle Rittenhouse was in the wrong, and to magnify the evil that he has committed, right? This is for people who've already decided what's happened, to tug at the sympathy and different things. There's a lot of articles and people wondering if Kyle Rittenhouse's crying was acted or not, right? Again, like not.
No, I think LeBron James tweeted out something about how Kyle Rittenhouse is clearly faking it and should just stop.
He starts like panicking. He's like hyperventilating. It's clearly very, very uncomfortable. Whether he's acting it or not, again, is completely irrelevant. Right? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Yes, a lot of a courtroom actually is a kind of drama playing out before the jury, right? But you wouldn't ask a 17-year-old to fake cry to begin with. Like, you don't rely on. Hopefully, you're not relying on that when all of the evidence is already in your favor.
By the way, I think he is 18. When I said 17,
you're right.
I was referencing when it happened, but I believe he is 18.
You're right. At this point, he is 18. He was 17 when it happened.
Or he might even be 19 now. How long
he could be. It's been a while. It's been a while.
That's crazy.
But it is interesting that in some ways people have a sense of whether they want to assign blame for what happened on him, in part because they think he shouldn't have been there. That the decision for him to be there was an immoral decision. That this kind of thing where you volunteer to go protect businesses, they use the word vigilantism, right? This is an act of vigilantism. It's not
well, and something I've found so weird about that, because I understand the argument, you should never be there, if you were really there for peaceful purposes,
you wouldn't have a weapon.
Why'd you bring a gun, right? And my immediate response to that is, well, what about this third guy, the guy who was testifying, who had a weapon there, but he was just there to peacefully protest? You can't have it both ways.
Right.
You can't say, oh, Kyle Rittenhouse brought a gun, that's how we know he had evil intentions, but the guy Kyle Rittenhouse shot who brought a gun and was there to peacefully protest only had innocent intentions.
Yeah.
If bringing a gun makes you guilty, then they should both be guilty.
Right.
And that guy should be on trial next.
Right. And it's a silly argument to begin with. You can protect property. Like, you don't need permission. Like, a security guard does not get some kind of special police badge or something like that, right?
Well, and it's important to note that if the case were, Kyle Rittenhouse stood in front of a building and people came towards that building and then he started shooting them, then you could have the argument, can you use lethal force to defend that building? But if he says he's there, to put out fires, give medical attention, and then it becomes different,
Yes, that's a good point.
Because at no point did he use physical violence to stop people from attacking a building.
Right, or to rob. No, you're right. That was part of the intention of why he was there. That was why and to give medical aid. But you're right that was not the events that played out. It was when he left and he was going somewhere else that he was attacked, and it's at that point that things took a turn.
We're recording on Saturday, and just yesterday they announced there are going to be some lesser charges that the prosecution has put forward that the jury can consider, which is going to factor in whether or not there's going to be some kind of compromise on some lower charge, which makes sense. The prosecution has not done a good job in this case. In fact, you could easily argue they've done a bad job.
Yeah. And the prosecutor face palms at one point, like literally, asks a question, gets through his own decisions to put someone on the stand and things. It leads to such a such a strong piece of evidence against him that he literally face palms.
Yeah, that's the one where the witness says that Rittenhouse didn't fire on him until he pointed his gun.
Was that when it happened?
That's why I brought that one up, because what happens is he drops that bomb. It's so bad that the prosecutor face palms, And all of the news articles talking about that witness testimony talk about the fact that he was so afraid for his life before he got shot. Like, that was the big bomb from that. That was testimony. The bombshell testimony, was that he was so afraid for his life, not the fact that he destroyed the whole reason the prosecution brought him up there. And anyways.
Right. Yeah, it really is odd. So there have been a number of, sorry, you were going to go somewhere else before
I was going to say, so we have the lesser charges that are being brought forward, and so we don't know what's going to happen with this jury. It's possible that he may get convicted of some of those lesser charges. Mm-hmm. I'd say it's very unlikely at this point that he's going to get convicted of the primary charges that were originally brought, which is why the prosecution would even consider bringing in the lower charges.
Yes.
If they thought they were going to win, they wouldn't do that.
Yeah, so these are lower charges for the same events, but not different crimes, but a different type of crime with that event. So yeah, so these charges are mutually exclusive from the original charges. You can't have both.
Moving from first degree to second degree.
They're not additional charges; they're different charges. One interesting thing of note in there is that the prosecutor tried to imply that by staying silent, Kyle Rittenhouse was admitting to guilt. Mm-hmm. Since Kyle Rittenhouse, judging from his conversations with the police and the way he interacted with them, and then his silence between then and the trial, and these different periods in which he didn't say things, that this implied something about it. And the prosecutor ended up getting berated by the judge, because you can't do that. You can't say that because someone's choice to use the Fifth Amendment to not speak is an admission of guilt, right? It eliminates the entire point of that choice. Mm-hmm. You say, yes, you can be silent if you want, but we're going to assume that if you're silent, that means you're guilty, right? Like that completely eliminates the point. There are a lot of interesting constitutional law cases that you can look at from just 60 years ago or even less. And of course, many before that, where the police are basically coercing confessions, right? They're doing all kinds of things that at this point are simply not allowed, because in practice they let the police do things that were in theory supposed to be prohibited, right? Things like coercing people to confess. And anyway, the judge almost declares a mistrial. He clearly considers it, and in the kind of mistrial that throws out the charges and says this is done and nothing's happening. But anyway, there's been talk of the judge's bias because his ringtone is patriotic and like all kinds of non-issues. But in a lot of ways, the real disagreement is not in whether or not this looks like self-defense. It does. It's in whether or not you think he was immoral in some way in making the decisions to be there in the first place, and thus that would make him accountable for the deaths. But that's not how justice works. That's not how that's not how you would make the case that he's some kind of murderer. By saying that by being there, he set things up so that they got killed. That completely ignores the personal responsibility elements and the individual guilt versus innocence in the system that we have. And I don't want a different system. I think that system is like, I don't want some kind of mob justice where like, no, you went there and you shouldn't have been there. And we're putting the blame for all of the chaotic events on you because we think your decision to be there was stupid.
Basically, if that's the kind of ruling that you'd have, what that means is that if you're on the wrong side of history, you're guilty. And it doesn't matter about the particular instances of the event. It just matters whether or not you're morally right or morally wrong. And if you're morally wrong, which is, of course, we'll determine, then you're just straight out of luck. You're guilty. Yeah. And that would be the creepiest ramification with serious consequences long term from this case.
Well, and it is what is called for when we say social justice. Mm-hmm. And why it's opposed fundamentally to individual justice. Mm-hmm. It suggests the symbolic understanding of Kyle Rittenhouse as this thing you were describing earlier is the right understanding, because it's about the social groups, not about the individuals. And yeah, it's a quick path to tyranny and to massive amounts of injustice. I hope the jury isn't so biased that they convict him of something serious. It's possible, but I hope not. It's so political, like you were saying, that you never know if the jury can't have been properly insulated from the events in the way that you would want them to be. It's
impossible.
Yeah, it's just, the news is just too big.
Not until cryogenic freezing is a thing. anytime a political crime occurs, we find 12 people who haven't heard about it yet. We cryogenically freeze them and then unfreeze them when the trial is ready to begin. That's all I got.
That's one possibility. The other one is you could offer the plaintiff, you could say, or the accused, you could say, would you like us to freeze you? And then you could be tried by a generation that doesn't know you.
There we go. We got all sorts of ideas.
This gives us lots of options.
Third option, I think we've mentioned this before, is we actually, instead of having a trial of your peers, we're going to fly you out to a country that hasn't even heard about this case, which there's probably only 2 in the world. And we're going to get some translators and we're going to get this taken care of.
A jury of specifically not your peers. Like, we're looking for anybody but your peers, because your peers would know. Even peers in the loosest sense are going to know. I like these plans. I like this. We need to find somebody we can run these past.
Yeah, we're gonna change the justice system through the use of cryogenics and air flight.
It's brilliant.
It's gonna be very expensive. Okay, moving on.
The second issue is vaccines, and this is one that Brad convinced me of, and we've talked a lot about vaccines, right? There's lots of things happening. The mandate's interesting. The statistics are interesting. There's the effectiveness of the vaccines is interesting. We've hit all of these at various points. What's left to hit, Brad? Walk us up to your issue.
So the simplest explanation for why we're talking about this is, as Dan put it, we don't want to talk about COVID. We've been upfront about that from the beginning, and so we talk about COVID when we feel like we need to talk about COVID. There's something that's not being said. And as Dan put it earlier today, as far as he had seen it up until recently, we had covered all the important things. We talked about how the vaccine was effective, not 100% effective, but effective. We talked about how there are risks to the vaccines that aren't completely covered, and so when you're looking at whether or not to get vaccinated, you want to do a risk-benefit analysis based off of your age and your other factors to determine whether or not that's a good idea for you. We've talked about how it's unethical to presume people are guilty just because of the possibility they could be infected, and therefore you can't do things like the vaccine mandate or restrict the freedoms of the unvaccinated as if they had committed a crime, and talked about the injustice of that. And we thought we were good, right? And that's kind of where we had left it. And I've been looking at stuff for the past week and a half, and I've been stewing with it, and it's just made me very uncomfortable. And as I told Dan a while ago, I felt like I was going crazy because I was seeing these things and then hearing what was being said, and there was this big disconnect, right? And I couldn't figure out what was going on. And I don't even know how to start talking about this, but let's talk about, I'm going to start with this LA Times article that came out quite recently, November 12th, so that's yesterday, talking about how the CDC is shifting their focus and kind of shifting the goalposts in terms of the vaccines. And quote, "Vaccines have been quite effective at preventing cases of COVID-19 that lead to severe illness and death, but none has proved reliable at blocking transmission of the virus," Jones noted. "Recent evidence has also made clear that the immunity provided by vaccines can wane in a matter of months." By the way, the Jones being referenced here is Dr. Jefferson Jones, who's on the CDC's COVID-19 task force. So the CDC is talking about the fact that the vaccine not only is waning, which everyone's been talking about a lot for the past few months in regards to the booster shots, and obviously the booster shot is the solution to the waning, effectiveness. Not only is it waning in effectiveness in that sense, but also it is not reliable at blocking transmission of the virus. Now, this is what got me going. Not this article particularly, but this fact, because this fact has actually been known for months. The CDC first talked about how there was this small village, I think it was in Massachusetts, where they realized that the vaccinated could spread the virus just like the unvaccinated. Not necessarily at the same rate, but they could definitely spread it. And the question then becomes, well, if they can spread it, especially at a decent rate, then why is there this talk about herd immunity, and why is there this talk about the unvaccinated being the main problem for spreading it and not the vaccinated? And it's interesting because later on in this article, just a few paragraphs later, it says, quote, "And if public health officials stop talking about the herd, people may lose sight of the fact that vaccination is not just an act of personal protection, but a way to protect the community." And as I read through this whole article, I'm trying not to cherry pick for you here. I read the article, and I'm not seeing an argument being made in this article about how it protects the community versus personal protection. In fact, the article seems to be making the opposite argument, which is that the vaccine has proven to provide personal protection, but has not been providing community protection in that herd immunity, because it's not stopping the transmission of the virus. And so that's the first thing. The first thing is this major confusion here. And then there's this other thing. We know that the COVID-19, sorry, I keep switching between the two and I lose track word-wise, that COVID-19 is the most dangerous for those who are older, especially much older, right?
Right.
And that those who are younger have very low death rates. Those who are under 18 have incredibly low death rates, which means that when we're looking at the people who are dying, they're almost all adults. In terms of statistical relevance, they're all adults. You know what I mean?
Right.
All of the, of the 600,000 or however many who have died, the vast majority are adults. That's what matters in terms of the statistical significance. And even more of those are from those who are older. And we keep talking about the fact that people aren't vaccinated, and that's the problem. But people who are 75 and older, 79.03% of this population are fully vaccinated, and over 90% have received one dose. Those who are 65 to 74, 82.84% are fully vaccinated, and 95.24% have had at least one dose. So 65 and up, everyone 65 years and older, which are where the vast majority of these deaths have come from, or at least the majority of these deaths have come from, are 79% or more vaccinated against COVID, right?
Right.
And then, of course, it's not like below that no one's vaccinated. You've got 50 to 64, 70%, 40 to 49, 60%, between 50 and 70% for the other adult populations.
Right.
And so when you look at the United States and you say, okay, the adults in general are at least 50% vaccinated.
They're much higher than that.
The most at-risk adults are closer to 80 to 85% fully vaccinated. 80 to 82, 79 to 82% fully vaccinated. And yet, we are still getting massive death tolls. And massive death tolls relative to the case counts. If you look at the New York Times source for cases and deaths, which is what you'll find on Google if you search COVID deaths in the USA, and we'll link this. If you look at the whole scope of COVID from start to finish, you'll see a small rise at the beginning, and then you'll see a big spike last winter, and then you'll see a decent sized spike this fall, right?
Right.
And that's in case counts. You then switch from case counts to death counts, and you'll see a mirror. You'll see a bigger spike at the beginning, the biggest spike during last winter, and then a medium-sized spike of deaths during this fall. And those spikes, especially those second two hills, match almost perfectly the case counts. And so, yes, the death counts are lower now than they were last winter, but they're not way lower. They're maybe 60% of what it was before, which doesn't add up if the vaccine is 90% effective and 80% of those who are most at risk have gotten the vaccine, and at least 50% of all of those who are basically at risk have gotten it. It doesn't make sense at all, especially when you match that up against the case count, because it should have way more cases per death. And so I'm looking at all of this data, which seems to disagree with the narratives that I'm being told across the board. This is not just CNN. Everyone agrees the vaccines are incredibly effective. They may not block it as well, but they should still be blocking it to some degree. They've argued for a long time.
Should be decreasing the deaths significantly.
Not just that, but that breakthrough cases themselves are more rare. So if you're vaccinated, you're less likely to get it, and you can still spread it, but you are less likely to get it, and you're less likely to be hospitalized and die. And yet, we're still neck deep in the pandemic. And I just can't figure out why. I haven't gotten a satisfactory explanation to what is going on. I feel like I'm going crazy. That's what I told Dan. I said, I feel like I'm going crazy.
It's interesting because I have not paid much attention to COVID at all. Where I'm at in Texas, I don't hear about it. Masks are optional virtually everywhere, with rare exceptions like maybe doctors' offices. Which is probably a good idea to wear a mask generally. The more you think about it.
In a doctor's office,
maybe in a doctor's office.
Might be the best place in the world to wear a mask.
Yeah, maybe that should be a normal thing. But anyway. And so I haven't been even looking at the numbers. I rarely run into people who are still arguing about it. There's in the Dallas area, the politics are pretty mixed in Dallas. It's a massive city. The ratio, I don't know what the ratio is off the top of my head of like Democrats to Republicans, but it's probably much closer to equal and maybe even favors Democrats. I would guess it probably favors Democrats. Just because that's the way big cities work, even in red states. But it's interesting to hear you talk about this because the numbers, I had felt like the numbers were pretty set, that we had a good idea of how effective everything was and how things were playing out. But then you started showing me some of these, like, oh, wait. People with the vaccine still transmit the disease. In fact, their peak viral load is similar in breakthrough cases. Breakthrough cases, we were trying to find how many, what are the odds of a breakthrough case? How likely is a breakthrough case?
And the great answer about that is that back in May, the CDC decided to stop tracking breakthrough cases unless there was severe illness attached to it.
Yes, and so the answer is we don't know. We don't know.
And you can't find out that data.
There are some
states. You can find it out in small
Yes.
populations where they do testing, but generally that data is not being collected in the same way.
You can't get a U.S. thing. Some states are doing it, and like you said, some small areas are doing it.
Because like the CDC is doing small investigations. You know what I mean? They're doing little tests to find information. Like that's how they found out about the vaccinated being spread in the first place, was testing this small group of people.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense. Then that rings a bell. But the way that comes out is we don't know what the breakthrough rate is, but it seems very high. And by breakthrough rate, we mean you got sick even though you were fully vaccinated. Now we do know,
or not even sick, but you got COVID-19.
Right.
You became infected.
Yes, right. You don't have to feel sick. You became infected, and the infection has spread through your body. And in which case, you're going to hit a similar level of how infectious you are.
Yeah, and that's what you're talking about with the viral load.
Yes,
that's the viral load. They found that the viral load amongst vaccinated was similar to the unvaccinated.
Yes. Now, you will be infectious for less time if you are vaccinated, because you're, it'll be a less severe case. But then things are fuzzy again. Right? So we go, okay, well that's bad. And that means, first off, the conclusion of knowing that it spreads among those who are vaccinated and that there are a significant amount of breakthrough cases is how many we do not know, but it seems like a ton. Then,
or at least a significant number.
Then vaccinations are not going to solve this, right? Herd immunity is not going to happen. The point of herd immunity is so that it doesn't spread. If it's spreading through breakthrough cases, if there are a significant amount of breakthrough cases and it is spreading from the people who have breakthrough cases, herd immunity is impossible.
because they will continue to spread, whether
We could
even
all
if
be
you have
vaccinated.
100% vaccination.
We could all be vaccinated.
Which we've already established is impossible.
Which is why that article that you were reading is bizarre, because then it talks about, well, wait. If we talk about this, it's going to lose sight of the goal of herd immunity. It's like you just quoted someone explaining why it's
going to lose sight
impossible.
of the goal that it protects the community when you're vaccinated, even though they don't have any evidence that it does anymore. You know what I mean? It's not clear that it's a way to protect the community.
Right.
It seems more and more that vaccination becomes a personal issue.
Right, which is interesting. But then to your second point, the data showing what you could say is, if our death rates are still high, it must be because we have way more cases. Because
if the vaccine is really effective at stopping people from dying, then you'd have to have more cases.
You have to have more cases in order to get this many deaths. But if you look at the cases listed, that's not the ratio of cases to deaths, which is how you would draw a fatality rate, is very similar. It looks like it's gone down, but not a lot.
And what's interesting, Dan, is that the argument that keeps being made is that the people who are dying are the unvaccinated, right? How many times have you heard that? The people who are in the hospitals, the people who are dying are the unvaccinated. Uh-huh. And we already know that the people who are hospitalized and the people who are dying are the elderly. And so what I'm wondering is the argument being made that this 20% of those 65 and older who aren't vaccinated are now getting infected at such a crazy high rate that they're able to get infected and die at a rate that they're making up for the fact that 80% of the population is now immune. Like, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that 20%, even if there were crazy high levels of transmission, like, it would have to be, 3 or 4 times more cases as there were last winter in order to justify that. Yeah. Really, this would have to be a huge outbreak of epic proportions to justify those numbers. Or am I reading it wrong?
No, that's one possible explanation. Well, no, that is the explanation, right? That's the only way it works. Unless by freak coincidence, all of the most vulnerable people are getting it, right? And no one else. Like the other things are so statistically unlikely that it just doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense, yeah.
So, yeah, it's possible that the total number of cases is way higher than what's reported. And like you said, it would have to be, depending on, who among whom it's spreading, it's got to be at least 3 or 4 times higher, and it should probably be like 7 or 8 times higher to justify that many deaths if the vaccine is as effective as it says. But and that could be the case, I suppose, if most of the cases just aren't getting reported now because they're so, so harmless. They're just not bad. But at some point, I don't know. There's so many questions here. Like, natural immunity is a massive thing. It's still the most effective immunity, and there's been a ton of people who've got COVID
already. Yeah.
Already. And maybe what we're seeing is, like you were saying, you mentioned that vaccines diminish in efficacy. Mm-hmm. Maybe they've diminished at such a rate that in practice they're just not very effective right now. In practice we might as well not. But it's got to be close to basically we don't have them for the numbers to make sense.
And here's my problem, Dan, because for each of the concerns I bring up, there will always be an answer. You say, okay,
right.
Well, there are these breakthrough cases, and they say yes, but it still protects against disease. And then you say, oh, well, people are still dying, and they say, oh, it's just because of that percent that's not vaccinated yet. They're all the ones who are dying. And then you say, well, how can you have that many? And they say, oh, well, it's because of the Delta variant. So the Delta variant's now spreading amongst the vaccinated and causing it. And each time there's this explanation, but when you keep stacking them on top of each other, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, there are too many places where the data doesn't make sense, right? You could explain any one of them, but all together.
Because altogether, if all of these things are true, then the whole argument that this is a virus of a pandemic of the unvaccinated, as Joe Biden once said, is not true. You know what I mean? If you accept all of those things, then your conclusion is that whether or not people get vaccinated really is up to them. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter. And so your end result is, okay, well, maybe that's why people aren't talking about this, is because the data seems to indicate more and more that, number one, this is not going away in any way, shape, or form. Number two, the vaccines, whether or not they're working to some degree, are not working the way we were told they would work at all. They're not going to end this pandemic in any way, shape, or form, and they're not going to protect other people in the ways that we were promised. And so many of the things that we've been told have now been shown to be completely inaccurate. And no one's talking about that fact. No one's talking about the fact that we're sitting here in what appears to be a web of, if not outright lies, then at least lies of omission.
Errors, yeah.
And the only people who are talking about it are conspiracy theorists. You know what I mean? That's how it feels sometimes, you know? And I think that's part of the problem, is that people don't want to talk about it because they don't want to get labeled in with those groups. You know what I mean? They don't want to get labeled as a whack job. And I'm not over here arguing that this is Bill Gates' master plan. I'm just saying, well, and honestly,
I'm just saying, what is Bill doing right now?
What? Yeah. Can someone point to me and say what Bill's doing? No, obviously I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that what I think is happening is you've got this noble lie, right? And the noble lie is all built on the idea that we have to get people vaccinated. That noble lie is now built on a foundation of so many lies that even the reason to have the noble lie is no longer there. You know what I mean? Because the whole point of the noble lie is we need to get people vaccinated. And yet that's not so clear anymore. It's not so clear that we need to get people vaccinated. People, you know, if you're still believing all of these things that are stacking on top of each other, then yes, people can still benefit from being vaccinated. But whether or not they are vaccinated is not as significant, because you're not going to achieve herd immunity. So you don't need to hit this tipping point. You're not ever going to get rid of the pandemic, which was what was being argued. It's just going to come down to a personal health decision, which we already have so many of those that people make on a regular basis. And yet we're not telling them how they should or shouldn't act. And so I just feel it's just weird. It's just weird. So many unanswered questions, Dan.
Yes. And as you said, all of these incongruities, all these moments where the things just don't line up, not only undermine all the stories, but they undermine every institution that's tried to explain it. Every group that's tried to make sense of this looks sillier and sillier because it doesn't add up. The numbers, you know, things aren't working out, and you can create an enemy, which is what the politicians do, right? You can say it's this group's fault, and that there's a lot of appeal in that, and people will buy that to some degree. But it really undermines the credibility of all the institutions. It really hurts any faith we have that an expert could have navigated this pandemic well, right? I think at this point, nobody could have walked through this in a way where they were making the right calls at the right time. I think it was impossible. I think we didn't have the information at the time. We still don't have the information, right? We still don't know basic things like how effective is the vaccine. We don't know.
Yeah, which is crazy that we don't know that.
Right. How effective is the vaccine at reducing death? I don't know. The numbers don't add up with the numbers we've seen thrown around. Right? How effective
is it as stopping infection? No idea. You know, how many breakthrough cases are there? No idea.
Right. Simple, not just simple things, but essential things, if you wanted to make good decisions about it, are unavailable. And you could probably find a paper on some of those things. I didn't dig too much into the most recent papers on this, but even then, that's the point, right? Is that what it appears to most people is that the science, or the argument that's being made, is that the science is obvious and we have to follow it. It's not. It never has been. It never has been in this pandemic.
No, and what's so frustrating is that we have, and this is something that a Dark Horse podcast talked about recently, is this illusion of consensus. Because what you have is, well, they have to be right because everyone's in agreement. And they point to articles where they say, yes, we're the vaccines are working. And yet when you actually read those articles that are so-called part of the consensus, they'll admit that actually in the details, it's not so clear. You know what I mean? Even though these are part of the consensus, the CDC agrees that the vaccine is working, even though the CDC openly admits they don't have data on so many of the critical areas that would help prove that the vaccine
that would tell you
is working.
how much it's working.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then you combine that with the fact that the pushback against people who are so-called anti-vax and unvaccinated is so incredibly strong in the media and in social media in so many different ways that people are strongly discouraged from having discussions like this one. You know what I mean? Without ending up in a group. A great example is Dark Horse podcast, where they have become the anti-vax podcast. You know what I mean? And have been, attacked repeatedly by many different organizations and groups and peoples, and have lost a lot of, they've lost a lot of their livelihood because of it, and keep getting grouped into many different things that they didn't want to be grouped into because they took a stand, and that's something that, we didn't want to be labeled as the, the COVID-19 podcast. That wasn't our goal. We wanted to talk more generally about things, but even having this conversation can put us into that box, and that discourages people from having the conversations and asking the questions. And the end result of that, which is what they talked about, is that it gives the illusion of consensus. They're like, no, everyone agrees. The science is clear. Everyone agrees. All the science agrees that this is what it is, and so let's just move on.
Having shot all the dissenters, we now have unanimous agreement.
having shot all it's not even that.
Right.
Having decided that some of these questions aren't worth asking, like how many breakthrough cases there are, we have concluded that the answers are favorable.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it doesn't. This is a lot of people, there's been a lot of talk about, as a segue into this next section, there's been a lot of talk about what do you do about the institutions, right? How do you, there's the question from the two sides. Why don't the people trust the institutions? Yes, they're wrong some of the time, but they should trust them. Their expertise is such that, they're the most likely to guide us through or whatever. But then there's the practical question of, if you're running such an institution, how do you regain people's trust? That's putting the responsibility on the right group, right? If you are acting in a trustworthy manner, then people's trust in you should increase, unless you accept that they're just crazy, which unfortunately, because of politics, is often how people are treated, right? It's much easier to demonize someone who's just crazy than someone who's reasonable, who you have to actually argue with. And that kind of battle line is half the problem. But if you wanted to improve the institutions, the tendency is to critique them. It's to say, this is how the CDC is wrong, right? And that is helpful to a degree, right? You need voices outside of especially when the institutions are very centralized, like the CDC is. Initially there were a lot of studies on COVID-19 from different universities that were virtually quashed, or they tried to quash them, right? That came up with anything that was remotely different from the political narrative. You need those. You need lots of different institutions looking at the same thing. And if you think on the whole, the institutions have become so corrupted that what they're doing is not good, right? You have to be constantly critiquing them. The solution is to build a new institution. It's very difficult to save an institution. What you need to do is you need to provide a better option that then can outcompete that institution. Then that institution will probably change. It'll probably start doing what you're doing, right? But it's in the creation of a new institution that real progress is made, not in the critiquing. It's not in unless you yourself are mean, in the process of critiquing, in some ways, you can aspire to become an institution under your own. But if you want to correct the CDC, you have to build something better than the CDC. And one of the groups that's doing this in a really cool way is the group forming the University of Austin. If you haven't heard about the University of Austin, it's put together by a bunch of the people we listen to. Right? It's put together by, it's founded by a bunch of people like Heather Hying from the Dark Horse podcast, who has found herself without an institution to call home, right? Doing their own thing, despite the fact that they can do it as well or better than anyone else, right? The super competent people who don't have a home in the institutions because the institutions themselves kick out dissenters. Barry Weiss wrote an article about the University of Austin, and she is also involved in it. Do you know her role specifically?
The article on her Substack is not written by her.
Oh, you were correct. Yeah,
it's written by the new president of the University of Austin.
Canelos.
Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce that name.
Yeah, Pano.
Yeah, I've never seen that name before. Pano.
Canelos is the last name, something like that. Yeah, it talks about. Thank you for pointing that out. I thought it was written by Barry Weiss. It's under her name in the Substack, but it's not hers apparently. I want to read a few lines from it because this is why they're looking at the other higher education institutions and they're explaining why they're creating a new one. Because you can always reform it, right? You can always say, go climb the ranks of some university, be a good influence, stay there, make it better.
No, that's always the argument that's given, right?
It is, yes. Nearly a quarter of American academics in the social sciences or humanities endorse ousting a colleague for having a wrong opinion about hot-button issues such as immigration or gender differences. Right? That's almost 25%. American professors.
Well, professors in those certain areas.
Yeah, in the social sciences or humanities, right? Which includes politics, psychology, right? Lots of the things where you're talking political theory. Any of those are going to be in the humanities and social sciences. All of the cultural areas are in the humanities and social sciences. All of the political areas, and nearly a quarter of them. If you disagree with them, if you have the wrong opinion, a different opinion than your own, are happy to oust you. Right? How's that for a working environment? 25% of your colleagues, if you disagree with them, want you gone.
Well, and it's important to note that in the context of the way universities were set up, and the reason we have things like tenure in universities was to insulate you, and by you, I mean the professor, from outside forces. That the idea of a university is this is a place where truth and learning is what we care about above everything else. And so we're going to protect you as professors, as students, from those outside pressures so that you can just think, and we can develop that more than anything else.
Yeah.
And ousting someone for thinking something wrong is not just thinking.
No, right. It's counter to the original goal. That is worth pointing out. Over a third of conservative academics and PhD students say they have been threatened with disciplinary action for their views. 4 out of 5 American PhD students are willing to discriminate against right-leaning scholars. You get into the undergraduates are even worse. The undergraduate students, if I guess 4 out of 5 American PhD students willing to discriminate against right-leaning scholars is probably the worst, but the undergraduates are much worse than the professors. 62% of sampled college students agree that the climate on their campus prevented students from saying things they believe, and nearly 70% of students favor reporting professors if the professor says something students find offensive. Professors, I've heard a number of interviews from professors who are self-censoring because they know that a significant portion of their students, apparently nearly 70%, are happy to report them if they're offended.
No, and there's plenty of anecdotal evidence for this. I mean, there's this new rise of I want to call them renegade intellectuals. A lot of them are popping up in podcasts. A great example of that is Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson, he had ideas that weren't politically correct. I mean, his idea was that you couldn't force people to say things. He didn't believe in forced speech. That's the stand that he originally took. And he was having students protesting his class. I mean, there was huge backlash in the university where he was teaching because of the things that he was thinking. You know what I mean? Because of the things that he was thinking, he couldn't teach his class in a normal way anymore.
Right.
And then you look at the Dark Horse podcast, Heather Heying and Brett Weinstein, and it's a similar story.
Right.
You know
They're
what I mean?
chased out of Evergreen literally by a mob.
Yeah, exactly. Where you have these mobs in these universities who are chasing out people who aren't thinking the correct things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's this in this essay in this letter he mentions thought police. This basically, we've got thought crimes here. Yeah, we could go on. It's disturbing to say the least. And so what do you do? Do you go there and be the professor who speaks their mind and then gets canned for it? Right? Mm-hmm. Do you risk that? Now obviously if the professors who didn't believe in this nonsense stood up, maybe it would work. But in some ways that time has already passed. Right? In some ways the mobs have won. You get the on most of the campuses, the student demands are treated as this kind of sacred moral obligation, where you get them pushing around not only professors, but the presidents and the other university administrators in ways that are ridiculous, especially when you realize how the funding works and that the payment of the students is actually not that essential. Like you can lose in a lot of these major institutions, they actually don't need the students at all.
But it's not even about the students voting with their wallets. It's about the fact that those protests, those mobs are being supported.
Yes.
By most organizations, you know what I mean? When the media reports on those mobs, they're not reporting on them as mobs. They're reporting on them as righteously indignant students who are standing up for these good ideas. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. And these old repressed university presidents who aren't letting them, achieve their goals.
Right.
And no one wants to stand up to that because they know they could be ousted quite easily because no one wants that kind of negative attention.
I can't believe what students get away with. Like the one where Jordan Peterson was speaking in a church and they went to the windows and were all banging on the windows of this church. And so you couldn't hear anything, right? So the whole lecture is paused, put on hold. And they start chanting, "Burn it down." This is French Revolution. Like this is mob rule in the craziest way. Of course they didn't burn it down, which is good, which is some good sign, I guess. It could certainly get worse. But I don't know how students can do things like disrupt speakers at an event and not simply get thrown out, right? They're campus police. And if you don't want to stick the campus police on them, fine. Tell them if they don't leave, they will be expelled. Mm-hmm, they're disrupting the events.
Start suspending students for disrupting teaching, which is what the university's there for.
Which is what you would do if a student just started like yelling in a class, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not like this, they've never encountered this problem. It's that they've allowed this problem. And so that it's become the norm. And in ways that are just bizarre. Like why, how did that become a thing? Why wouldn't you just kick them out? You've got hundreds, often hundreds or even thousands of students at an event with a speaker. And they're allowing a small group of them to disrupt the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Like there was often money paid to the speaker, right? This is a formal event. Why on earth is that being tolerated? Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be. It's bizarre. It's bizarre. I don't understand it for a second. And it's it's why you need this. It's why the University of Austin is coming together. And they talk about what they're going to do, the warped incentives of higher education. They mentioned that, I mean, a lot of colleges, I said that colleges are not competing for money. They are. The biggest ones are not. I'm talking like the Ivy League ones, which are also engaging in this kind of kowtowing to the students that they don't have to. Smaller universities are really struggling because the student enrollment is going down, and COVID has absolutely just destroyed that, right? But this is the kind of institutional creation that we desperately need. We need people with reputations, good reputations, to come together, not just one or two here. This is one of the things that I've never understood about podcasters or popular speakers, that they don't coordinate their efforts to create things. And some of them do, and I mean they're trying. I don't mean to be so critical of them overall, but it seems like tactically they could be extremely effective with their influence.
And I think this is just another evidence of the fact that they've realized that same thing, and they are changing how they're doing things.
This is it. Joe Rogan could single-handedly build a university. Like, I don't know if he probably knows that, right? You listen to Joe Rogan talk about his own influence, and he's like, I don't know, man. I just have to keep doing what I'm doing. Because if I think about it too much, I'll probably change it, and then it won't work. But they have so much power. They need to flex it to create useful things. This isn't flexing political power to impose your ideas on someone else, right? This is to offer an option with good values and a good product, right? This is to make a business that works.
And using your influence to do things like secure funding and to attract potential students. You know what I mean? When you combine, this group of individuals, Neil Ferguson, Barry Weiss, Heather Heying, Joe Lonsdale, Arthur Brooks, Kathleen Stock, Dorian Abbott, and Peter Boghossian, just to name a few, because they go
Pinkerton and others,
and list many, many more. When you combine their influence, there are millions of people who have learned, through a long period of time, that these people are worth respecting and worth listening to, and they've worked hard to earn that respect, and now they're doing something with it. And I think that's truly awesome.
The news about it is fun. I don't know if you've looked at any of it. The new university for conservatives, ideologues, and I don't remember, in Outsiders or something like that. Most of these people are very liberal, right?
No, yeah. I mean, Barry Weiss and Heather Heying in that list, they are not conservatives. To call them conservative would just be straight nonsense.
Wrong, yeah. Their political views are not conservative. But they are independent thinkers, and they're worth listening to. They want to reason and think things through, and highly recommend both of them. It's just, they're just not conservative. Not that we're conservative either, but they just don't fit that label, right? It's just interesting. And it's you
could accuse
exciting.
us of being conservative more than you could accuse them of being conservative.
Yes, that's true.
Sure.
That's true. That's true. We certainly have more overlap than they do. Yeah, it will be an incredible group of people, and honestly, their influence is such, it's so stacked that I can't imagine this failing unless they except perhaps in some government. Well, they're doing it in Texas, which helps. Getting it through the accreditation thing is difficult, but with this group, it shouldn't be that. It shouldn't be a problem. They should be able to do it. This group is so competent and so and have so much influence between them and the place that they've chosen to do it and whatnot. I can't see this getting stopped. But anyway, it's exciting. It's exciting, and it could be a turning point. This is what you need. You need to stack it so strong that it can't help but succeed. And you could do that in a variety of different institutions.
Yeah, because they're going to receive serious obstacles. It's going to be harder for them to get accredited than it would be for a normal small university.
Yes, there will be every barrier that can be put in their way will be put in their way. But I think they'll succeed. I think it will be. It could be an overwhelming success. It could change the landscape. So it's nice to end on an exciting note. Something's being created.
Good things.
If we
and this is just one part of this, and people keep labeling it as a conservative or ideologues and all of this, but really it's just independent people who who are doing things differently. Barry Weiss creating, her Substack and hiring reporters to build an actual organization is just an example of that. Joe Rogan creating a source of news and conversation and actual thought that isn't controlled by any major media organization. These are all examples of new, not even institutions yet, but the kind of seeds of institutions that are creating very viable alternatives to institutions that have become just ineffective is really exciting.
Mm-hmm. It is so exciting. I hope all the best for them. It's the kind of place that I would, we could see ourselves associated with just because the goal is so good. The efforts
Absolutely.
are so many people there that I respect. This is the kind of thing that if Brad and I were ever to be super influential, we'd probably spend half our time doing the podcast and half our time coordinating these kind of things, because this is how you actually change things. Part of it is giving people the ideas and talking through those things. But so much of it is in the creation of new institutions that must happen and in the coordination of those kind of things. I would love to see something like this with political parties. I mean, Andrew Yang's doing something, but it's that's a fragment of the power that could be mounted, that a group like this could put together.
Mm-hmm.
With that, thank you for listening.
This has been an episode of Rethinking Politics. You can find us on all of the major podcasting apps or on YouTube. You can reach out to us at rethinkingpoliticspodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit our website at rethinkingpolitics.podbean.com, where you can support us via Patreon. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.